I wonder, have any of you ever had somebody come up to you and express what they really think of you? Maybe they say, you're the greatest person who ever walked the earth. Or maybe they have other comments that are not too complimentary. When Jesus Christ walked the earth, he was criticized constantly by his distractors, by the Pharisees, Sadducees. He was called a wine bibber, meaning, you're a drunkard. They said, you've been born of adultery. You're a Sabbath breaker. You're a false teacher. You've got false ideas. You're trying to overthrow the government. That was another accusation. You want to destroy the temple. So, what was he going to do? Bring a bomb in, blow the temple up? They accused him of that. And they even went so far as to say that Jesus Christ was demon-possessed, that he was influenced by Beelzebub, the chief of the demons. Now, that's what a lot of individuals who didn't like him said, because they looked on him as a competitor. What did God the Father think of Jesus Christ? Well, we have several instances, but there's one back in Matthew 3:17, where the Father sent a message saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Matthew 3:17. So God looked on him as a beloved son. He wasn't a rebellious son. He was one who was beloved, and he was well pleased with what he was doing. Now, the Bible is full of messages from God to mankind. All you have to do is go back and read Revelation 2 and 3. Here are 7 churches mentioned, 7 attitudes that you find that are prominent in the church at any given time. These were 7 literal congregations that existed in Asia Minor. And God revealed to them what their deficiencies were, also what their strong points were. To all of them, he said, "He who overcomes, will be in my kingdom." But you also have to endure to the end. Moses and Aaron were sent by God to deliver a message to Pharaoh. And that message was, "Let my people go." And it also said, "Let them go keep a feast to me." The book of Daniel also contains a unique message from God that applies to events taking place today that actually transcend the centuries, the millennium, and come down to our day today. This Thursday, as we know, is the Feast of Trumpets, which pictures a time when God will finally get the attention of the rulers of this world. And he's going to get the attention of all mankind, and he's going to begin to talk to them in the only language they will understand at that time. Now, the book of Daniel focuses on this, and we want to spend most of our time today in the book of Daniel. And I want us to take a look at the message that God has for us, and the message that God has for the nations, and the message that God has for the people of the earth, and what he is sending at this time. Let's go to Daniel chapter 1. And we'll begin in verse 2, Daniel 1 and verse 2. As we go through this, you might think, well, this sounds like a Bible study. It's going to be a sermon study. And we're going to go through, we will be reading a considerable amount of the book of Daniel, but only those verses that really illustrate what we're talking about. In verse 2 here, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now, I want you to notice that God was involved in this, or God allowed this to take place, that God allowed Jerusalem and Judah to go into captivity. And God, through the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, different ones had already predicted what was going to take place. Now, you would think, if you were among the Jews at that time, such as Daniel was and his companions, that you would wonder, where is God if he allows you to go into captivity? Here you are, you're obeying God, you're serving him, and all at once you're hauled off into captivity. What could God possibly have in mind for you? Well, we're going to see that God was working something out beyond what Daniel and his companions might have thought. What verse 2 shows is the sovereignty of God. That God intervenes in history at any point that he needs to carry out his plan and his purpose. And there was a reason why God allowed Judah to go into captivity. And God said 70 years later they would come back out of captivity. Daniel and his associates went into captivity around 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 605 to 562 BC in that period of time. Why did God allow Ezekiel to go into captivity? He was by the river Chebar, as we read in the book of Ezekiel. Why did he allow Daniel to go into captivity? Why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They were being positioned in different locations. Daniel and his friends were positioned at the palace, at the heart of the government, at the seat of power. Ezekiel was out with the people, and he was, living with the average Jew. And God positioned each one because he had a duty and a responsibility for them to carry out. Now, as we read through this, you ask yourself the question, why are you where you are? Why has God positioned you where you might be? Why has God called you now? Why didn't God call somebody else? Somebody else with maybe $1 billion who could really bankroll what we're doing. Why has he called us? Because we want to address that as we go through this. Notice verses 3 and 4. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men, for all of you who are young adults, teens, whatever. Notice, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good looking. These were not the ugly ducklings of the kingdom, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. God had prepared the opportunity for Daniel and his friends to influence the king of Babylon, as we're going to see. They had an opportunity to be in a unique position that few have had. God had a purpose to work out. You might remember God had chosen ancient Israel, and he brought them out of Egypt. They were to be a light and example to all the other nations around them. He chose them for a purpose, not because they were more righteous or better, but he chose them for a purpose to be an example to all other nations. Now, God also gave an opportunity, a witness to the Gentile rulers. And I'm referring specifically here to Babylon to start with. Babylon at that time, you might remember, had decimated the Assyrian Empire. They were the strongest empire on the face of the earth. Mighty Babylon. And God brought into the very heart and core of Babylon 4 young Jewish men. They could have still been in their teens, early 20s. Doesn't say precisely. But why were Daniel and his friends selected for this special training? Again, here's a lesson for all of us who might be young. Why were they selected? Well, as it says here, as we've already read, that they possessed knowledge. They were gifted. They didn't have blemishes. They were good looking. They were smart. They were swift of mind. They had already applied themselves. They didn't come into Babylon being dumb clucks. They came into Babylon. They'd already been educated. They'd already been trained. They were individuals who understood and applied themselves. They did not have blemishes. They didn't have tattoos all over their bodies. They didn't have a lot of body piercings. They did not blow their minds on drugs. They had given themselves to study, and they were sharp as a tack, and they were able to, the rulers were able to see that. God intervened to give them favor, as the Bible says. So God's intervening on their behalf, but if they had not been the material to start with, there would not have been anything to intervene for. So God intervened, but immediately they were met with a challenge and they were met with a problem. Notice verse 5. Verse 5 says, the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine, which he drank. In other words, it's the same type of food that the king had, same type of drink he had. And they were to go through 3 years of training. Now, Daniel and his 3 friends here, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, decided that they were not going to eat the king's delicacies or drink his wine. Now, you might ask why, and it doesn't specifically say. It just says they didn't want to be defiled. It could have been unclean meats involved here. Much of the food that had been cooked or would have been cooked and prepared back at that time, they would have not known what exactly was in it, how it had been prepared, what it was seasoned with, any number of things. So they didn't want to defile themselves. And you'll remember the story. They asked if they could eat vegetables and grains instead of eating the king's delicacies. Notice verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. How do you fall into favor with someone who's in charge of all of the eunuchs? Well, Daniel was given favor by God, but also he was an individual who could communicate, who could talk, as we will find out, who had the ability to express himself, who was smart, and I'm sure that he set an excellent example. And so therefore, he didn't give any trouble to this individual. He had been given favor. But the chief of the eunuchs said, hey, I can't do this. If I do this and you look poorly, then it's going to come back on my head. Now notice, Daniel came up with a plan. He didn't take no for an answer. He came up with a plan, as we'll see here in verse 10. Says the chief of the eunuchs, said this to Daniel, but down in verse 12, he says, please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Vegetables there also imply grains, so vegetables and grains, and not the delicacies, the refined food that the others were eating. What was Daniel doing? He was relying upon God. He was wanting to obey God, to honor God, and God blessed him. God backed up his action. Doesn't say that God necessarily told him, ask for a test. It didn't happen that way. He just simply thought, well, maybe 10 days, if just give us 10 days, and if we don't look better, then, forget about it. So they did that, and you'll find that after 10 days, they looked fatter, stronger, healthier, better than all of the others. So they were allowed to eat their vegetables at that time. Now in verse 19, says, verse 18, at the end of the days, in other words, after 3 years, they were brought into the king. The king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. And all manners of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better. That's pretty good. I'd like to be 10 times smarter than your competition here. So when school was over, everybody's ushered in. The king brings them in. He starts asking them questions. They were outstanding in what they were able to say. They made a great impression upon Nebuchadnezzar. God allowed them to go into captivity for a purpose and a reason. He handpicked them to be trained. God gave them special ability and knowledge, as we will see. And they then were noticed by the king. They were positioned to give a witness to the leadership of Babylon. God wanted them there for a reason. And you'll find as we go on here that they were given very high positions. Now in chapter 2, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. Now I want you to notice the second year of his reign, they were taken into captivity during the first year of his reign. So the 3 years of training are not yet complete when this happens. They're still in training for Daniel and his buddies, at this time. Now, Nebuchadnezzar calls in all the wise men, the magicians, soothsayers, anybody who's supposed to be able to have spiritual contact, tell him about the future, and said, I had a dream, tell me the dream, and interpret the dream. And of course, they looked at him, O king, live forever. That was always the first thing out of their mouths. We want you to live forever. However, no king has ever made a demand like this. Tell us the dream, we'll interpret it. Well, I think Nebuchadnezzar realized that if they claim to have supernatural power to interpret, they should have supernatural power to tell him the dream. So they hem and they haul. They're not able to come up with it. Nebuchadnezzar is very mad at them. Verse 9, chapter 2. If you do not make known the dream to me, there's only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words. Now we find he didn't trust these men. There obviously was political intrigue going on within the palace. And this was one way to get rid of them, get them all killed, and come up with other men. So they, with lying and corrupt words, because are before me till the time has changed, he said. Therefore, tell me the dream. And then he said, if you don't tell me the dream, I'm going to kill all of you. You're dead. And he was angry. And he gave as you'll read in verse 12, he gave the command to go out and destroy them all. Now we got a problem, because Daniel and his 3 friends are part of this group. They're looked at as part of this group. And you will find here in verse 13, the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then with counsel and advice, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard. Now notice, the king's guard came in, about to kill him. Hey, wait a minute, what's all of the urgency, Daniel asked. And he explains it to him. And Daniel said, well, bring me before the king. And he goes before the king, and the king, he requests time. In other words, set a time, and I'll come, and I will tell you the dream, and I will interpret the dream. Now, I want you to notice, he knew that he didn't have the ability to do this, that God was going to have to give him the interpretation of the dream, and tell him about it. Now, there is one thing that you need to stop and realize going on here. There is an adversary out there. He's called Satan the devil. And he is trying to thwart God's plan in any way he wants to. The fact that you had Daniel and his 3 friends at the very heart of the government, there was a certain element of protection there for the Jews in captivity. They could be there if there was something coming up or going to happen, they could intervene on their behalf. And so God provided them there, number one, for safety and protection for their fellow countrymen who had been taken captivity or into captivity. But also Jesus Christ was going to come through Judah. And so God wanted that lineage to continue on. And so God intervened here on their behalf. So they faced a major crisis. And how were they going to handle this crisis? They all went to the room and they got down on their knees and they prayed. Now you'll notice God didn't immediately reveal to them the interpretation. Daniel was the one who had been given the ability to interpret dreams. So they went to their rooms, and while they were sleeping that night, God gave to Daniel the vision and the interpretation. So Daniel comes back and he interprets this. Now, I want you to notice as we go on here that Daniel had the ability to articulate, ask questions, get answers. He was bold. He had courage. He was not afraid to go before the king and say, "Oh, king, you set a time and I'll come to you and I'll tell you." And so the king probably said, "Well, tomorrow morning you show up here and you tell me." And so he appears. Daniel had to have faith that God would intervene on his behalf to give him the dream and the interpretation. Otherwise, he's a dead duck. He's had it. So God did intervene. Again, it's another lesson, I think, for our young adults, for our youth in the church. What if Daniel had been a shy person? What if he had been reticent? What if, the Arioch, the guard in charge of the guards had come to him and said, "We're going to kill you." Why? And he's not able to talk. He's not able to express himself. And, while he's trying to figure out what to do, he gets his head lopped off. That doesn't work. But he was bold enough to speak up. He had courage. God intervened. He had faith. And let's notice in verse 21. Daniel comes before Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells him this. He changes the times and the seasons, talking about God. He removes kings, and he raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. So he realized that God was the one who gave him understanding. Now in verse 28 and 29, you find that he gives credit to God. He says, "There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the vision of your head upon your bed were these." I want you to focus on the expression, the latter days. I believe we are living in the latter days, at the time of the end. Now, how close? None of us really know. But we certainly are living in the end of the 6,000-year period that man has to rule over himself. And so Daniel was inspired by God to say this vision, ultimately is for the latter days. And he summarizes here for him the vision. He talks about he saw a great image, head of gold, then silver, then bronze, then iron, and then the feet of clay and iron. And then he begins to interpret that for him. Notice in verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods." Now, I want you to notice what he did not say. Your God is the only God. He said, your God is the God of the gods. In other words, he believed there were other gods, but obviously, whoever Daniel was worshiping had to be pretty powerful because he revealed to him the dream and the interpretation of the dream. Now, the interpretation, we know that the image, the head of gold, was Nebuchadnezzar, followed by the Medes and the Persians, silver. Bronze was Alexander the Great in the Grecian Empire, followed by Rome. And finally, you get down to the feet, the 10 toes, which come down to our day today, as we will see. Now, the interesting thing here is that Nebuchadnezzar, a total pagan king in charge of all of Babylon, has the true God introduced to him. God revealed himself, in one sense, through Daniel, that Daniel tells him that, look, I didn't do this on my own. God revealed it to me. He gives understanding of secrets. God has the wisdom, and that it is the God of Israel who's above all so-called gods, and he therefore is God. So Nebuchadnezzar had revealed to him the whole course of history, what was going to happen from his day down to the return of Jesus Christ. And that's what it talks about, because there was a stone, if you remember, cut out that hit the image on its feet, knocked it down, it shattered and broke up, it blew away. There was no trace of it found, and the stone that did that filled the whole earth and became a mighty kingdom, talking about the kingdom of God being set up. What does the Feast of Trumpets picture? It pictures the return of Jesus Christ to the earth. And what is he going to do? He's going to put down all rule, all authority, all governments, and he's going to set up his kingdom. And his kingdom, once it is set up, will rule over all nations forever. And there will only be that kingdom. Now, in verse 48, let's notice another problem. The seeds of another problem are sown. As a result of what Daniel did, the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Chief province, like Washington, D.C., the headquarters. This is where the palace is, where the authority is. And chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. He was right there with the king. He was his advisor, because the king recognized the wisdom that he had. Now, you take a young man who's maybe in his late teens, early 20s, mid-20s, and put him over all of the affairs of Babylon. What's that going to do to all these older men who are around, have been used to being in charge? Would you say there could be a little envy, jealousy, a little greed? Well, what are we going to do with this guy? How are we going to get rid of him? Now he's brought his own buddies in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so now you've got a different dynamic going on within that empire. Now in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. Okay, here he makes this large image of gold. Verses 5 and 6, everybody was to fall down and worship it and bow before it. When the band struck up, and when they struck up, the alarm went off, everybody is to fall down before this image. Now there's a little problem with this. There happens to be a commandment that says you're not to worship any idol. You're not to bow down before them, do any of that. So here's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When the band strikes up, everybody bows down. Guess what? If everybody's lying flat on the ground on his face and you're standing, there's a problem. And that's exactly what happened. So they did not worship the image. Now in verse 8, they did this, and they noticed it. They brought them in, as verse 8 says. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. So, okay, there's always somebody watching you, and they accused them. Now, verse 12. They bring this accusation. There's certain Jews here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refuse to obey you, O king. They do not serve your God or worship the gold image. Nebuchadnezzar, out of his benevolence, gave them an opportunity to repent and change. He said, hey, when you hear the band strike up, if you'll fall down and worship, everything will be okay. Guess what? They said, well, we're not going to do that. And they didn't. Now, God allowed another major test for these young men. And this is a major test, because if you don't do it, you're going to be thrown in a fiery furnace. And the king was angry at you. And you can see the veins extended on his neck and his face. And he's furious at you. You better fall down and worship my idol. Well, they basically say here in verse 17, after they were told to do this, they refused, and they said, if this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image. Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. He heated the furnace up 7 times. It's so hot that the men who picked them up to throw them in are killed. So now they are thrown in. I want you to notice, here's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, God will deliver us. Okay, at what point is God going to deliver them? Well, they bind them up. They pick them up. They're ready to throw them in. Surely at this point, God will intervene. We're in the air. God's going to put something over the furnace door. Nope. We're falling, and they're inside the furnace. But we're not burning. God intervened at the last second to save them. And not only that, he sent an angel to be among them. And when Nebuchadnezzar and all of those around him looked, not only were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace, but there was one like the Son of God who was there also. 4 men, not just 3. They were not hurt. Now in verse 28 here, Nebuchadnezzar asked them to come out. Not a hair on their head is singed. Their clothes are not burned. There's no smell of smoke on them. It's as if they had been out walking through the pasture on a bright sunny day. Nothing had happened to them. And Nebuchadnezzar spoke. Now here's the second time, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Same God who's the God of Daniel, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Now these guys were good at making decrees, so he makes another one. I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Now, he still has not acknowledged that the God of Israel is the only God. Now, I want you to notice something here, that God is actually giving the Babylonian ruler and all of those who are his advisors around him an opportunity to repent, an opportunity to know what's right and who the true God is and to change. Now the question is, will they or do they? So this is the second time that God gave a witness to the head of the Gentile kingdom of Babylon. Remember when God chose Israel, brought them out of Egypt? He performed a series of miracles, and those series of miracles got the attention of the nations around them. And the nations around them, whenever Israel came anywhere near them, feared, because they were afraid that God would do the same thing to them that he had done to the Egyptians. Now here is a decree that goes out to the whole Babylonian Empire, saying, if anybody speaks a bad word against the God of Israel, he's going to be killed. So the knowledge, the information is spread to everyone and proclaimed. So it's interesting how this witness went out to everyone. Now, what if Nebuchadnezzar at this point had said, I've learned a lesson. It took me a couple of times here, but you worship the true God. I'm going to worship him too, and I'm going to command my people to do so. What if that had happened? How would the world have turned out since then? Well, it might have been completely different, but obviously it didn't happen that way. Chapter 4, he still hasn't gotten the point, Nebuchadnezzar, but God is not through with Nebuchadnezzar yet. In verse 2, Nebuchadnezzar says this, I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. He has another dream. And in the dream, he has a vision. It's of a great tree that grows up to the heavens. It's got lovely leaves, great branches going out. Fruit is in abundance, food for all. Birds live in the tree. All of the animals live underneath the tree. Then they come along and the watchers say, chop it down. It's chopped down. So there are no branches, no leaves, no food. Scatter its fruit. All that's left is the stump and the roots with a band of iron and bronze around it. And in verse 16, let's go over here, chapter 4, verse 16. It says, let his heart be changed. Now, one of the watchers, or an angelic being, came down, and obviously it's talking about a tree, but it's also talking about the leader of the nation of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast. Let 7 times pass over him. This decision is a decree of the watchers and the holy ones. Why? Why is God doing this? What's the purpose for it? Notice the last part of verse 17. In order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. That they would know that God is in charge. He is sovereign. And he gives it to whomever he will, and he sets over it the lowest of men. So many times we see political figures who are the lowest, as far as their morals, their wisdom even. And this is why God allowed this, brought it about, because he wanted them to learn a lesson. Now, it's interesting that in the future, there are going to be two witnesses, and we'll touch on this a little more as we go on, that will confront the great political and religious leaders of our day here in the future. Man will have to come to know that God rules in the kingdom of men. And God will show the world, even at the end time, that he is in charge. So Daniel interprets this for the king, and he tells the king. And Nebuchadnezzar had a lesson that he needed to learn. Notice here in verse 25, that they will drive you from men, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the earth, and you'll eat grass like like the oxen. Last sentence of verse 25. Until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. God is in charge, and he will give to whomever. Okay, that's exactly what happened. Now, it's interesting, though, if you note, God didn't do this immediately. He waited a year. Nebuchadnezzar had a year to think about it, consider. Maybe as time went on, he began to think, well, yeah, Daniel said this. Generally, what he says comes true. Nothing has happened. And then one day, in verse 30, Nebuchadnezzar's outside walking around. He beholds Babylon. He sees all the power, everything. And the king spoke, saying, is not this the great Babylon that I have built? And for a royal dwelling by my mighty power, for the honor of my majesty. See, he didn't give God credit, that God rules in the affairs of man, and he gives it to whomever he wills. He didn't do that. That very day, he was driven out, and for 7 years, he was like a beast, eating grass, insane, just totally not understanding fully what was going on. His problem was a problem of pride, the same problem that many leaders, most leaders, have even till today. In verse 34, you find that at the end of this period of time, in verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praise and honor him who lives forever. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. Now, verse 37, Nebuchadnezzar says, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his way justice. And those who walk in pride, he is able to put down. Now, it's interesting. Nebuchadnezzar, after 7 years of what he went through, seems to have a little different attitude at this point. Now, what eventually happened? We don't know. And, the Bible doesn't say much after this. Did he try to worship the true God? Did he really learn a lesson here? We don't fully know. You come to this point. Now, the 7 years, we've always understood that Nebuchadnezzar had the mind of a beast, was a type of the period of the Gentile rule. You have a day for a year in prophecy, 360 days in a prophetic year, times 7, 2,500 years that the Gentiles would hold sway until the time that God would bring forward Israel, the British Empire, and the United States at the time of the end, where the last century and the part of the century before was the century of the Israelites, so to speak, or of America and Britain. But they are described as beasts being motivated by a heart of pride and power. But eventually he was given the heart of a man, and there's going to come a time in the future when the nations of the earth will go through what the Bible describes as a tribulation, a horrible period of suffering, and mankind, though, will finally come to realize that there is a God, He is in charge, and they will submit and obey, and God will set up His kingdom. You might remember in chapter 5, Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, is now king. He's ruling, makes a great feast. They're feasting, they're eating, they're drinking wine. He calls for all of the vessels that were in Solomon's temple, bring them out. They drink wine out of them. They praise the God of gold and silver. Now, while he's doing this, there's a hand appears and writes on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. And you can imagine what is this? Well, again, nobody can interpret it. And it's always at the last they bring Daniel in. It's not at the first. But, it shows that the soothsayers, magicians, and so on didn't have any understanding, but Daniel did. They bring him in, and he tells them, look, Mene means your days are numbered. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That very night, Babylon was overcome and overrun, and the Medes and the Persians took over. Now, you find that very interesting scripture, though, as Daniel is talking to Belshazzar. Notice verse 22. He describes to him what all Nebuchadnezzar went through. He rehearses the history. And he says, you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. So you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. You saw it. And yet you refuse to humble your heart. Now there's a lesson there for all of us. Can we learn from the mistakes of other people? Can we learn from good examples and bad examples? The Bible is a book that is written, especially the Old Testament, the histories, the prophecies. There are bad examples in what happens when you break God's law. God gives a law. It's like a grammar book. Subject and verbs, a singular subject should have a singular verb. And then you have in a grammar book all kinds of examples of, what's singular and showing you so that you get the idea. So is it with the Bible. God gives us His law. Then He shows what happens to a people when they break the law, the curses that come upon them. Then He shows what happens when you obey the law, the blessings that come upon you. And so He tells Belshazzar, you didn't humble your heart. And so, you're not going to stick around either. So can we learn lessons, and do we learn lessons from others? Chapter 6 is another classic example. Chapter 6, Daniel is thrown in the lion's den. Might remember the Medes and the Persians are in charge now. And they set 3 governors over the land, and Daniel was one of them. And Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps, and he exercised the spirit of wisdom, and God was with him, and God blessed him. And so therefore, again, the other men were envious of him. And so they asked Darius to make a decree that for 30 days nobody can make a petition of their own God or worship anyone make a petition of anyone but the king. If they did, they would be destroyed. Well, they knew they couldn't find anything wrong with Daniel. As it says, he was faithful. There was no fault found in him. He didn't steal money. He kept the books correct. He handled everything with wisdom. So what were they going to find wrong with him? Well, you find that they said it's only in his worship of his God. So they found him praying. They knew that he prayed 3 times a day. They brought it, this knowledge to the king. And it's very interesting that Darius realized he'd been conned. He realized that they had taken advantage of him. And he liked Daniel. And in verse 16, the king gave the commandment, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the lion's den. The law of the Medes and the Persians was you can't change it. So he had to do it. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, who you serve continually, he will deliver you. Now, Darius must have had some contact with Daniel, knew about his worship, had heard about what all had gone on, perhaps in the past. Well, the next morning he runs to the lion's den and he says, Daniel, are you alive? Daniel says, yes, sir. I'm here. God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, and I've been delivered. So then the king took those who accused Daniel, threw them in the lion's den. Before they hit the floor, they were torn to shreds by the lions. The lions were so hungry. They're just pussycats in there with Daniel. You maybe go around, pet them, and talk to them, and and sit there, got a good night's rest, waiting for the door to open. And these men were killed. Notice verse 25, again, interesting. Another decree goes out. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree, he says, that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. And he has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, the Persian. It was Cyrus who allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, if you'll remember. Now, this decree went out to the whole empire again. So not only does Babylon hear about it, now the Medes and the Persians hear about the God of Daniel. And it goes out to the empire. Every time Satan tried to undermine the plan of God or to destroy the servants of God at this time, God intervened. And they had to stand up for what they believed. But God turned it back on them, on his enemies, and God intervened on his behalf. So, the rest of the book we won't read through. Daniel 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are all prophetic. God revealed many visions to Daniel, told him about future events, and many of them are for our day to day and for the future. First 6 chapters are a little different. The first 6 chapters have a lot of prophecy in them, but it's interpersonal relationships that shows you how the servants of God were faithful, obeyed God, and how God intervened on their behalf. And in so doing, how God witnessed to the leaders of those empires. It is interesting that God prophesied there'd be 4 world ruling empires that would come along. And I say that at least one of his representatives testified and witnessed to each one of them. Now, what do I mean by that? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did to Babylon, Media, Persia. What about Alexander the Great and the Grecians? The only historical account that we have of Alexander ever coming in contact with the religion, let's say, or the God of the Bible, he had come through Palestine, destroyed Gaza, and he went up to Jerusalem. This is according to Josephus in the Antiquity of the Jews. He went up to Jerusalem, and when he came, the high priest, Jaddua, had a dream the night before that he was to put on a purple robe, put on his mitre with the name of God, go out and meet Alexander. Now, while Alexander was in Macedonia, Alexander had a dream that he saw this individual dressed in purple with this mitre that he was going to meet, and that in the dream he was told, go conquer, because I will lead your armies. So he meets the high priest. He sees all these priests dressed up, and bingo, this is what my dream was all about. He goes up to the temple with the high priest. They offer up a sacrifice. In the temple, the high priest shows him the book of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, where it says that there was going to be a king of Greece who would conquer the whole world. And guess what Alexander surmised? That's me. So therefore, he praised God, sacrificed, to God, and went on his way. So God, whether he recognized it or not, God actually inspired a dream to Alexander, inspired a dream to the high priest, brought them together, and he had to acknowledge that the God, and this is what Josephus says, he acknowledged and paid homage to the God of Israel. What about the Roman Empire? You might remember Paul was thrown in prison, and what did Paul say? I appeal to Caesar. So he goes to Felix, he goes to Agrippa, he's seen all of these lesser kings. He's finally taken to Rome, and he sees Caesar. Now, what did he tell Caesar? Well, we don't have a record of what all he said to Caesar, but if you know what he said to Felix, what he said to Festus, what he said to all of these other kings, you pretty well have an idea of what he probably said to Caesar. This is how I was called. This is what I did. This is how I'm being accused. This is what I'm saying, preaching. And we know that he was let go after that. Now at the end time, the Roman system of governance is mentioned in Revelation chapter 17. You might want to just jot down Revelation 17. There are 10 kings mentioned there, 10 horns picturing 10 kings. There is also a great ruler called the Beast who is mentioned, and there is a religious leader who directs and sits on top of that very beast. This is the same power described in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, pictured by the 10 toes. 10 kings, 10 toes. The book of Revelation clearly shows that at the end time there will be 2 men, servants of God, who God will call, who will stand up and resist the great false religious leader and the great political leader who will help to unite Europe, will unite the beast power together, and will fight against Jesus Christ when he returns. Let's notice in Revelation 11 and verse 3, Revelation chapter 11 and verse 3. And this certainly does tie in with the day, Feast of Trumpets. In verse 3, it says, I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 2,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And if anyone wants to harm them, verse 5, fire proceeds from their mouth, and they devour their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. Now notice verse 15. Then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven, saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. He will reign forever and ever. Isn't that what we found in Daniel 2, the stone being cut out, striking the statue, filling the whole earth? Same event being described. God will not leave and never has left the nations without a witness. He did with ancient Israel. He did with the start of many of these Gentile empires. God will at the very end time. And Daniel was an example and a witness to the kings, two kingdoms back at that time. Remember, I asked you the question, have you ever had anybody say to you what they thought of you? How would you like God to come down, send you a message, maybe on Facebook, tweet you, leave a message on your cell phone? What would he say about you? Well, let's notice in Daniel 9:23, Daniel chapter 9 and verse 23, the message that God sent through Gabriel to Daniel says, at the beginning of your supplication, the commandment went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Would you not like to know that you are greatly beloved of God? Same thing is said in Daniel 10 and verse 11. If you'll notice, Daniel chapter 10, verse 11, he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you. Says the same thing in verse 19. God's message to Daniel is, well done. You're greatly beloved. You're doing what's right. What about us? The word greatly beloved there means to delight in greatly, have a great desire for, to be precious. Daniel was somebody that was very precious in God's sight. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 13, we read this. 2 Thessalonians 2:13. But we are bound to give thanks to God always for you, brethren, beloved by the Lord. Do you realize that you and I likewise are beloved by God? The word there means to be loved. It comes from agape, from that root. And God loves us. So if you and I have been called today, we've been called for a purpose and a reason. Let me just summarize for you very quickly the lessons that we learned from Daniel, his friends. Daniel and his friends never compromised God's way. If God said it, they did it. And they did not compromise, even almost every time under threat of death. When confronted with life and death situations, they always obeyed. And they had to obey as young men. In other words, they were so convinced, even as older teens or young adults, that they would not compromise God's way. As a result of their obedience and where God positioned them, God gave a warning to the Gentile rulers of Babylon and Media Persia. God has given a warning or witness to the major ruling empires down through the ages. God will do the same at the end time. And God has called us for what reason? Why are you in the church today? Matthew 24:14. This gospel of the kingdom is to be preached in all the world as a witness. That's one reason. God is preparing us to rule with him in the kingdom. But one is to take the gospel as a witness today. Daniel was a man who was greatly beloved by God. We likewise are loved by God, so much so that he was willing to give his only begotten Son. The book of Daniel is there to give us a glimpse of the future. The book of Daniel was also written for our encouragement. If we obey God, he will bless us. It shows what happens when a person obeys and does what is right. So remember this. You and I are beloved of God.